5. Rororo ran. He was gigantic, and the terrain was marshy, but he could sprint almost as fast as the Lizardman. He made huge splashing noises as he went. His amber eyes were clouded from the heat, and 2 of his 4 heads were already limp. Still, he ran on. Another fireball came flying and hit him. The fuel inside flared up all at once, and the flames licked his body. He felt throbbing pain like he was being punched over and over. His eyes dried up, and the hot air burned his lungs. Still, he ran. He ran and ran, his feet never stopping, one in front of another. His scales peeled off in the heat, and blood erupted as the skin beneath crinkled and curled up. Even then, he didn't stop. If he were a witless beast, he would have naturally turned tail and fled, but Rororo didn't flee. Yes, Rororo was a magical beast, a hydra. Some magical beasts were smarter than humans, while some were no more intelligent than any other animal. Rororo was more like the latter. It was mysterious, a wonder, that Rororo, with his animal brain on the verge of death, would continue to rush toward Iguva, who was causing him pain. In fact, his enemy Iguva couldn't understand it. He even considered that the beast might have been manipulated by some kind of magic. But that wasn't it. No, it was something else. Something Iguva couldn't understand. Rororo, with no more intelligence than an animal, was running for his family. Rororo didn't know his parents' faces. It wasn't that hydras abandoned their young. Babies lived with one parent until a certain age, learning the skills to survive in nature. So why hadn't that been the case for Rororo? It was because he was deformed. Usually hydras were born with 8 heads, and as they aged they grew more, sometimes as many as 12. But Rororo had been born with just 4, so his parents abandoned him and took only his siblings with them. As a newborn hydra without parents to care for him, regardless of how big he had the potential to grow up to be, in the unforgiving wild it would only be a matter of time before his young life was extinguished. Except a male lizardman happened to pass by and pick him up. That was when Rororo gained a mother, father, and childhood friend all in one. Through the pain, with his numb mind, Rororo hazily recalled something he was always wondering. Why am I so big? Why do I have all these heads? He thought about this sometimes when he looked at his dad, his family, and he had an idea. Maybe these extra heads will fall off, and I'll grow arms and legs long like grass, and I'll look like Dad. And then what would they do? Oh, we'll sleep together for the first time in so long. He'd gotten so big that they ended up sleeping in different places. That made him just a little lonely. Flames filled Rororo's field of vision, blowing his thoughts away, and searing pain pummeled him again. He emitted a feeble cry. There was no longer any place he didn't hurt terribly. A sense of peaceful warmth came from behind him, but it felt so weak to his scorched body. He endured the pain like being bashed with innumerable hammers. It hurt so much, too much, he couldn't think. His legs became frantic, unending spasms signaling him, telling him to stop. But... Did Rororo stop moving his legs? No, he did not. He advanced. Yes, his speed had slowed to a crawl. The flames burned his flesh, pulled at his muscles. It was impossible to run at his usual pace. Even taking a step forward was unbearable. It hurt to breathe. Just trying to inhale one more gasp of air was difficult. It was possible his lungs were burned. Still, his feet would not stop. Now only one of his heads was moving. The others were nothing more than dead weight. In his clouded field of vision, he could make out the undead conjuring another fireball in his hand. Rororo's instincts screamed at him, "I will die if this attack connects!" But Rororo was not afraid. Forward he moved, single-mindedly forward. He'd been asked to do this by his mother, father, friend, so there was no way he could stop. He desperately, staggering slowly, his energy spent, advanced a few more steps. When the undead loosed the crimson flames through the sky toward him, they would burn up the rest of Rororo's life. It was undeniable. In other words, death. The end of everything. Except that male was here. Would he let this happen? This absurdity? Not in a million years. Icy burst! Zaryusu jumped out from behind Rororo and, running parallel to him, swung Frostbane at the same time he shouted. A wall of white frost appeared in front of Rororo, as if the air itself had frozen, starting from the tip of Zaryusu's sword. It was frigid, a wintry torrent brought forth by Frostbane. This was one of the magical sword's abilities, a special move that could only be used 3 times per day. Icy Burst. It could chill everything in the area and cause massive damage. The wall that Zaryusu whipped up blocked the fireball as if it had physical strength. A jewel of fire and a wall of cold air, magical logic made it appropriate that these two should clash. Impact. The fierce battle between flame and frost began. The two devoured each other like cannibal snakes of red and white. After an instant of equilibrium, they both faded. The undead was shocked and visibly panicked. That was the most apt attitude to have after his magic vanished. There was still some distance between Zaryusu and Iguva, but they could make out each other's facial expressions and movements now. Rororo's desperate march had brought the 3 lizardmen this far across the seemingly impossible distance unscathed. Rororo! Zaryusu got choked up for a moment. Of all the countless things that came to mind to say, he chose one that was extremely concise and pure. Thank you! With that shout, Zaryusu ran forward without turning to look back at Rororo. Krush and Zenbel followed immediately after. Behind them, a nearly fainting voice replied, a cheer for his family. Iguva's eyes widened. His fireball had been negated. He expressed his disbelief in words. This can't be! He cast another spell. Of course, it was fireball. He didn't want to admit that the one who had erased his spell was the lizardman currently charging his way. The fireball raced toward the 3 lizardmen. The one out in front swung his sword and created an icy wall to repel it, and both spells disappeared. Yes, it was the same thing that had happened before. Shoot as many as you want! I'll erase them all! He heard the lizardman shout. Iguva clicked his tongue in annoyance. I was created by the Supreme One, Lord Ainz. How can this reptile scum block my magic? He frantically calmed his mind, seething with rage. There was an extremely good chance that Fireball wouldn't work against them anymore, but the fact that they had approached by hiding behind the Hydra meant there had to be some kind of limit on how many times that spell could be used. Maybe he could use it 10 times. Maybe each use consumed some of his health, so as long as he healed, he could use it an infinite amount of times. How should I deal with this? If possible, I want to find out if what he said is true. Iguva could still shoot plenty of fireballs, but he couldn't tell if the lizardman was bluffing or not. They were only 40 yards apart. Also, as far as he could tell, the lizardmen approaching him were warriors. As a caster, he didn't want a close-quarters fight. That was why he couldn't use Fireball. He wasn't foolish enough to try and see how many more they could block under these circumstances. If they hadn't been behind the Hydra, if they weren't so close, he might have tried experimenting, but his chances for that had been ruined by that pesky Hydra. You damned Hydra! Aguva spat and decided to make his next move.
How about this?
Luckily for him, everyone just happened to be in a straight line. He pointed a finger at the 3 rapidly approaching lizardmen. Shocks sparked around it.
Take this, and taste my thundering wrath! Lightning!
White lightning streaked across space, and then, even at a distance, he could see it, the white light coming from Aguva's hand. Lightning! Frostpane's icy burst could block chill and fire attacks, but Zaryusu had never tried using it against lightning, so he wasn't sure if the sword could block it or not. Should they take the risk? Or was it better to disperse, make themselves less of a target, and limit the number of injuries? Zaryusu tensed the hand that held Frostpane. The air felt like it was buzzing with electricity, proof that the shock was on its way.
Leave this to me!
Before Zaryusu could make a decision, Zanbel rushed out in front with a shout. At almost the same time, the spell was cast.
Lightning! Ah! Massive resistance!
Right at the moment the lightning flowed into Zenbel's body, he flexed his muscles. As a result, the bolts that normally would have passed through to the others scattered. Massive resistance. It was a monk ability. By radiating chi from their entire body for a moment, the user could reduce incoming magic damage. This was something Zenbel had learned on his journey he took after being defeated by Frostpane's special attack, Icy Burst. Whether it was an area of effect spell or any other kind, as long as it did damage, this ability would take effect on it. Cries of surprise went up on both sides, but Krush and Zaryusu, who believed in their friend, were only mildly surprised. They took advantage of the undead's shock to invade his space. I see, thought Zaryusu as he ran. If he had used Icy Burst back when they'd been fighting one-on-one, Zenbel probably would have blocked it using this move and defeated him in the opening created. That was why he'd invited him to use it.
Ha ha! This is a cinch!
Zaryusu's expression softened when he heard Zenbel sounding so confident, but an instant later he was tensed up again. He realized there was a hint of pain mixed into his voice. If a male as strong as Zenbel wasn't able to bite back the pain, the damage must have been pretty significant. And Zenbel wasn't the type who would agree to the plan of having Rororo run out in front if his move defended him perfectly. Zaryusu stared ahead. They were only 20 yards away. It had been such a long way, but this was all that was left. As the party pressed in on him, Aiguva concluded that they were powerful opponents. He had to hand it to any ability that could block his magic. Of course, he still had other methods of attack, but he had to think about defense, too.
A nice sacrifice, most suitable for showing them how mighty I am.
Aiguva grinned and cast a spell.
Summon 4th tier undead.
The marsh belched, and 4 skeletons armed with round shields and scimitars stood up to protect him. They were skeleton warriors, undead so strong they couldn't even be compared to regular skeletons. There were other undead he could have summoned, but the reason he chose skeletal warriors was to elude the chill attacks. Aiguva and all bony skeletons had perfect resistance to chill. Protected by his bodyguards, Aiguva watched the party's approach with contempt. It was the attitude of a champion awaiting contenders. Eventually, the distance between them closed. Just 10 yards. That was all that was left. Yes, that was all. Zaryusu made sure the undead wasn't going to attack and looked over his shoulder at the distance they'd traveled. Just to run it 100 yards was nothing, but this was a no-man's land with nowhere to hide. Rororo, Frostpane, Zenbel, Krush. If any one of those elements had been missing, it would have been impossible. An absolutely uncrossable distance. Now it was gone. The remaining gap could be closed if he reached out his hand. They'd been able to overcome it. He felt just a little relieved seeing Rororo being carried back to the Lizardman village, then scolded his buoyant heart and glared at the undead. It was a horrible being. Zardayusu frankly acknowledged that. If he hadn't encountered it in this situation and instead caught sight of it at a distance, he probably would have chosen to run away as fast as he could. Just confronting the thing made his tail stand on end, and his instincts told him to flee. He could see out of the corners of his eyes that Krush's and Zenbel's tails were also stiff. They must have felt the same as Zardayusu. Yes, they were suppressing their desire to flee in order to stand before the undead. Zardayusu whapped their backs with his tail. Startled, they both turned to him.
"We can do it,"
Zardayusu whispered simply.
"You're right, Zardayusu. We can do it,"
Krush answered, rubbing the spot where he'd whacked her with his tail.
"Huh, it'll be fun."
Zenbel laughed with a cocky look on his face. Then the three of them advanced across the final stretch. At a distance of 8 yards, Zardayusu and his friends, panting after their sprint, faced off against the undead, who didn't breathe at all. The first to speak was their enemy.
"I am Iguva, an elder lich in service of the Great One. If you bow your heads, I'll grant you painless deaths."
Zardayusu laughed in spite of himself. He saw that this undead, Iguva, didn't understand a thing. There was only one way to reply. Iguva waited for their response without showing any displeasure at Zardayusu's smile. He had the elite arrogance of one who knew he was strong, one who was confident he could kill them. That arrogance had allowed them to close the final stretch, so Zardayusu was thankful for it.
"Let's hear your response." "You need a response."
Zardayusu held up Frostpain and tightened his grip. Zenbel put up his fists and got into a peculiar fighting stance. Krush didn't move in a specific way, but she reached toward the reservoir of magic deep within herself, so she would be able to cast at a moment's notice.
"Then here's our response. We refuse."
Judging that reply sufficiently hostile, the skeleton warriors raised their round shields and brandished their scimitars.
"Then pain-filled deaths it is. Know that you have rejected my final offer of mercy." "The dead should go back to the world of the dead, Iguva."
The decisive battle began.
"Go, Zardayusu!"
Zenbel, who had charged faster than anyone, drove his huge arm into a skeleton warrior. Despite the fact that the skeleton warrior used its shield to block, he kept forcing his fist in. A huge dent formed in the shield, and the skeleton warrior backpedaled into another one and lost its balance. Then Zenbel used his tail to attack a different skeleton warrior, but missed. The skeleton warrior line broke, and Zardayusu slipped in through the opening.
"Stop him!"
At Iguva's order, 2 skeleton warriors swung their scimitars at Zardayusu. He could have dodged if he wanted to. He could have also blocked with Frostpain, but he didn't do either of those things. Evading was, in a way, simply delaying his own actions. He couldn't waste a move with Iguva right in front of him. And more than anything, Earthbind! Mud whipped and wrapped around the 2 skeleton warriors. The mud whips stopped them like chains, giving Zardayusu just enough time to get through the gap. Yes, Krush was with him. Zardayusu wasn't fighting alone, so all he had to do was trust in his friends. Krush was a good caster, but her magic couldn't stop their movements entirely. Their scimitars did barely graze Zardayusu's body, but what did that matter? He was so exhilarated his brain didn't sense the pain as pain. He ran, and he pointed at his target, Iguva. Even if he were hit with attack magic, he would power through and reach him. That was how tough his will was.
"No fear, you fools! Scare!"
Zardayusu's field of vision wavered, and, unable to comprehend where he was standing, he was assaulted by a vague anxiety, like something in the area was about to attack. His feet slowed. The psychic spell Scare had shaken him so much they wouldn't move. His brain was screaming at his feet to go forward, but his heart wouldn't move them.
Zaryusu! Lion's heart!
At the sound of Krush's voice, his fear dissipated and his fighting spirit blazed at twice the intensity of before. The courage spell had cancelled out his fear. Iguva glanced at Krush in displeasure and jabbed a finger at her.
How obnoxious! Lightning!
White lightning flashed,
Ugh!
and Krush's scream echoed. As Zaryusu set off running again, hatred nearly overtook his heart, but he held it back. Certainly hate was a good weapon, but against someone strong it could be a burden instead. Against a tough opponent one needed emotions like fire and a mind like ice. Zaryusu didn't look back. Iguva had attacked Krush, the rear guard. That meant that Zaryusu could close the gap between them during this time. The understanding that he'd made a mistake appeared on the undead's face. That brought a sneer to Zaryusu's, despite the fact that the female he loved had been injured.
Too slow!
Zaryusu swung Frostbane from the side with all his might and hit the hand Iguva had been extending.
Ah! You let a warrior get up close, caster. Let me show you that you can't use spells anymore.
Perhaps it was different for the mages of legend, but in general, if an enemy closed in on a caster, there was a chance their spells would be prevented with an attack. An immensely powerful monster like Iguva was no exception. Zaryusu narrowed his eyes a bit at the feeling traveling down his arm. A strange sensation had lingered when he cut. It meant Iguva had some kind of weapon resistance. Still, he wasn't unharmed. Right. If he had some damage resistance, all Zaryusu had to do was deal more damage. He just had to slice and slice and slice like crazy, that was all. Of course, that was easier said than done. The saying was nothing new to Zaryusu. As a warrior, he could do only what he was capable of.
Don't underestimate me, Lizardman.
3 shots of light flew from before Iguva's face. Zaryusu was startled by the lack of casting motion and instinctively held his sword up as a shield, but the bolts of magic went by it and sent a heavy, dull pain through his body. This was silent magic, magic arrow. Silent magic didn't have any preparation that could be hindered, and magic arrow was ordinarily impossible to evade. Even Zaryusu couldn't dodge it. Gritting his teeth, Zaryusu lashed out with Frostbane.
Gah! Damn you, Lizardman!
Magic arrow may have been impossible to evade, but it didn't do a terrible amount of damage either. It wasn't about to take someone like Zaryusu, who had punished his body to its limits, out of commission. Another round hammered into him. The pain reverberated at his core. Zaryusu suppressed it and swung his sword. This back and forth repeated a few times. Zaryusu gradually slowed. The ache was leeching the agility from his movements. The difference between him and the undead who knew no pain became obvious. Both Zaryusu and Iguva saw it, wearing contrasting expressions. The strong would win, and the weak would lose. That was the natural order of things. If Iguva and Zaryusu fought, the results would be clear. However, it was also true that if the weak combined their powers, they could equal the strong.
It'll cure wounds!
At the sound of the voice, Zaryusu's pain disappeared and his energy returned to him. Iguva had been feeling confident, but the spell from the rear enraged him, and he shouted,
You damned Lizardman!
Zaryusu was fighting with comrades he trusted, Krush, Zenbel, and
Rororo! I won't lose! Nonsense! I was created by the Great One! There cannot be any defeat for me, you fools!
Iguva's eyes blazed with loathing for the 3 of them. The reason he hadn't used any summoning magic was that the undead from his last spell were still around. Until they were destroyed, he couldn't summon any more. That was why they played out the same monotonous exchange. Iguva shooting silent magic arrow, and Zaryusu slicing into Iguva's flesh. It seemed like the fight would go on forever. Then the only thing to do was to leave the breakthrough to the ones fighting in the rear. The battle would be decided by whose reinforcements arrived first. They both knew it. Krush pushed through the pain shooting through her body from the lightning and cast Summon Third Tier Beast. A huge, almost 5-foot crab with a giant right pincer appeared with a loud splash. It showed up as if it had just been sleeping in the swamp, but of course it had been summoned with the spell. It advanced, stood next to Zenbel, and clobbered a skeleton warrior with its giant pincer. Zenbel grinned at the unlikely backup. He was happy to have the help, since he was protecting Krush while still under attack from every direction.
All right! Weird thing. Take those two.
The crab, a snap grasp, waved its smaller pincer as if to say, "Understood," and turned to the skeleton warriors.
We're in this awful situation, but I can't help but notice how similar they are.
Although it felt out of place, Krush smiled, but she wiped the expression off her face a moment later. Watching the battle, she struggled to keep her breathing even. Between the defensive and healing spells on Rororo during their approach, and the support spells for Zenbel, she had cast too much magic. She was even using summoning magic now, so she was completely exhausted and could barely even stand. She didn't have enough energy to heal her own wounds. She couldn't fight anymore, so she'd made the level-headed judgment that it would be a waste to heal herself. But if she collapsed now, she'd be anxious for Zenbel and Zaryusu fighting up in front. Blood dribbled out of her mouth. Her oral cavity was injured, and she tried to stay conscious.
It'll cure wounds.
She cast a healing spell on Zaryusu, who was fighting at close quarters with Aguva. Her legs gave out, and her field of vision blurred. Her whole body could sense water around her. Why that was, she couldn't comprehend at first. She didn't notice, but at some point she had fallen and sunk into the mud. She realized soon enough and confirmed the lack of new injuries, so she must have just lost consciousness for a second and collapsed. She felt relieved, not that she was still alive, but that she could still fight. She didn't even try to stand up. No, she didn't have the energy to stand. It would have been a waste. The backs of Zaryusu and Zenbel floated in her hazy field of vision. They were her comrades, with whom she'd traveled and fought so far, although it was just a short time they'd spent together. Both of them, Zenbel, matched evenly against the 4 skeleton warriors with a little help, and Zaryusu, withstanding Aiguva's magic attacks, were covered in wounds. Krush desperately steadied her breath and shot spells.
It'll cure wounds.
She healed Zenbel.
It'll cure wounds.
She healed Zaryusu. She choked in and out. Something was wrong with her breathing. She inhaled frantically, but it felt like the air wasn't entering her lungs. It was probably due to using too much magical energy. Her head was pounding, but still she forced her eyes to stay open. How much had they sacrificed so far? After all that, they couldn't be the first to withdraw. Krush's eyelids seemed about to fall, but she held them open, and she cast,
"It'll cure wounds."
Zenbel drove his clenched fist into a skeleton warrior's skull. The sensation of creaking resistance turned into one of crushing, and the skeleton warrior was destroyed. He heaved a breath like he was exhaling his exhaustion, and scowled at the remaining skeleton warriors. The crab Krush had summoned was already gone, but because it had occupied 2 of the skeleton warriors, Zenbel had been able to defeat the 2 others. He'd gotten this far with Krush's support. Now there were 2 left, the ones the crab had been holding off. When he was done with them, he could move on to Aiguva. He flexed his huge arm. It could still move. His left arm was covered in injuries, and he couldn't really tense it. He'd used it to shield himself from sword strikes too many times. He gazed absent-mindedly as it hung limply at his side.
Well, it's a fine handicap.
He glared at the skeleton warriors and moved his left arm a bit. A pain that he would never have thought could come from just moving one of his fingers coursed through his entire body. But what did it matter? His friend had continued charging, even though some of his heads had become dead weight. Could Zenbel Gugu do something so laughable as give up now? How strong was a skeleton warrior? Zenbel had fought them, so now he knew. 2 of them against him would be an even match. That's how strong they were. If he had had to fight 4 at once, he might not have been able to win.
Thanks to that crab. Maybe I shouldn't eat mud crabs for a while.
After giving thanks to his favorite food, he turned his attention back to the 2 approaching skeleton warriors. He balled up his fist. He could still fight. He could still stand. Honestly, he wondered how it was possible.
Huh! This is no time to think crap like that.
There was only one reason. He scoffed at his doubting self of a moment ago. He saw Zariusu's back beyond the skeleton warriors. His comrade didn't retreat even 1 step, despite Aiguva's overwhelmingly powerful presence.
That's the biggest reason.
Yes. Zariusu and Krush, Rororo, they had all fought together. That was why he could still fight.
Whoa, Zariusu! You're really beat up. That's worse than the time you fought me, isn't it?
He swung his powerful arm at the attacking skeleton warriors and sent one flying. The other answered with its scimitar, and he didn't manage to block it completely with his left arm, and another cut opened on his flank, around where Krush had healed him before.
Krush is doing awesome, even though her situation sucks, too.
She'd shot over another spell that began to heal him. He didn't turn around, but he heard her voice right at water level. He could imagine from what position she was casting. How could she still even use magic?
What a great female.
If he was going to marry, he wanted a female like her. Zenbel felt just a little jealous of Zariusu.
I don't want her to see me collapse first. That'd be pathetic.
He feinted with his huge arm and whipped with his tail. Then he grinned.
Plus, I'm older than them.
The 2 skeleton warriors, concealing themselves with their shields, steadily closed in on him. The shields hid Zariusu from his view, which triggered an intense emotional reaction in Zenbel.
You're in my way, damn it. I can't see that cool male.
He let out a war cry and charged. Aiguva and Zariusu's back and forth continued. It was a fight where their eyes remained glued on each other, so Zariusu felt it when Aiguva glanced away for a moment. His undead face warped in a horrifying grimace, and what happened next turned Zariusu's body and soul to ice. There came a splash from the rear, the sound of someone falling.
Look! Your friend collapsed.
He didn't turn around. What Aiguva said might be true, but it might not be. A feeling like his scales were being pulled welled up inside him. But his enemy was overwhelmingly powerful. He didn't have time to turn and look. It was clear that the battle would be decided the moment he turned. Zariusu hadn't come all this way to lose in such an idiotic way. He had come here to claim victory. Still, if what Aiguva said was true, he'd be in trouble if he didn't find a way to deal with the enemy reinforcements that would be coming up from behind him.
I guess I'll take 1 magic hit.
As Zariusu steeled himself, there was some heavy splashing, as if someone was trying to stand up, followed by the sound of multiple bones breaking.
Zariusu, I'm done for. The rest is up to you.
Me'll cure wounds.
With Zenbel's pained words, a huge splash echoed. With Krish's voice, which was barely a whisper, Zariusu's wounds began to heal. At Aiguva's displeased face, Zariusu didn't even have to turn around. The 2 of them must have done exactly what they needed to do. Then next up is my turn! He swung Frostbane, but Aiguva repelled it with the staff in his hand.
I am Iguva, Elder Lich. Just because I'm inferior in close quarters combat doesn't mean you should discount me.
Despite his boast, Iguva felt it with a chill that his chances of winning were low. If it were one-on-one, he probably could have claimed victory, considering the gap in their abilities. But with the White Lizardman healing wounds from the rear, their positions in terms of remaining health had reversed. Then came 3 attacks, of which Iguva was able to block only 1. The other 2 cut into his body. He had resistance against cutting weapons, like a skeleton, and the additional chill damage had no effect, but this was still an extremely bad situation for him to be in. His blood boiled. He had been created by the Great One, his master Ainzul Gon, as the commander of this army. Loss was unacceptable. He at least wanted to summon some undead soldiers to guard him, but with his ability, summoning magic took time to use. It would be pretty tricky to use it with an enemy right in front of him. At this rate, he'd be overcome. So he decided to use his last resort. It wasn't a very good move. Depending on the situation, it could be considered a bad one, but it was the only move he had left. Zaryusu hesitated before attacking as Iguva suddenly turned his back and dashed away. Iguva took the blow in his back and staggered but didn't fall. Zaryusu clicked his tongue at Iguva's seemingly infinite health and ran after him to close the new gap. Iguva turned around. His face was twisted up in a rage that didn't seem very undead, but there was a hint of glee showing through as well. A red light glowed in his hand. Fireball. Zaryusu, who had closed in, had doubts. An area of effect spell at this distance? Does he plan to self-destruct? No! Fear welled up in Zaryusu's breast as he realized Iguva's gaze wasn't directed at him. He was looking behind him, at Krush and Zenbel, who were probably already down. What should I do? Zaryusu stopped to think. This was a big chance. If he abandoned them, he could finish off Iguva. If he didn't, though, he wasn't sure how the battle would go. Neither of them had much health left. There was an extremely high probability that one wrong move could mean the end of his life. To win against Iguva, wasn't that why they were here? And they'd sacrificed so many of their comrades. He had to leave Krush and Zenbel. Surely they would smile and forgive him. He would if their positions were reversed. But he didn't choose to abandon his comrades. He would save them and defeat Iguva. Once he'd made his decision, the rest was easy. Icy Burst! Zaryusu created a wall of chill at his feet. Grrrr! The word ultra-painful failed to describe the agony that assaulted him. Desperately clinging to consciousness, Zaryusu focused his piercing gaze on Iguva and endured the pain. As a scream broke through his gritted teeth, the chilling mist enveloped the pair of them and dominated the area. Enveloped in the white frost, Iguva grinned, as Zaryusu expected. It was like he was saying, he could have claimed victory if only he had abandoned his comrades. Iguva was immune to chill and electric attacks. That was why he could just stand there in this torrent. He clamped his hand around the fireball to put it out. If he let it go and hit the white mist swirling around him, he'd essentially be blowing himself up. He could follow up with another attack on those 2 lizardmen after the mist disappeared. The first one he had to crush was still standing. Iguva scanned the area and frowned. He had miscalculated one thing.
Now, where is he?
All the mist was obscuring his view. Iguva could see in the dark, but he didn't have an ability that allowed him to see in conditions with bad visibility. As a result, he'd lost his enemy. But he didn't need to worry too much. Judging by the distress in the lizardman's voice, he must have suffered fairly serious wounds. After all, he'd radiated enough chill to cancel Fireball. The damage should have been equal to the fire spell. One wrong move with wounds that heavy could be fatal, so Iguva could take his time stomping him out.
I guess I should get through this mist first,
Iguva thought, but he immediately discarded the idea.
If I move now, I'll give away my position.
The first thing he needed to do was summon more undead. If he summoned more guards, his victory was certain, even if the lizard man was still alive. As he was about to cast, Iguva suddenly heard a splash. One of the 4 great treasures handed down through generations of lizardmen, Frostpain. Legend said that it was carved out of the ice that formed the only time the lake that never froze. It had 3 powers. The first was the ability to deal additional chill damage when cutting an opponent because its blade was enchanted. The second was the special move Icy Burst, which could be used 3 times per day. And the third... The air sounded like it was ripping. The tip of a sharp blade appeared in Iguva's field of vision faster than he could even detect what it was. Something made impact in his head. The blade that had entered his left eye disturbed his brain. Finally understanding what had happened, Iguva screamed in shock.
Why aren't you dead?
Frostpain was sticking deep in his left eye socket, and he felt a chunk of his life disappear. Zardayusu's hazy figure appeared before Iguva in the mist, covered in frost, as the Elder Lich reeled with the blade still in his head. Iguva couldn't understand. How was Zardayusu still standing after taking so much chill damage? Frostpain's third power was the ability to protect the one who equips it from virtually all chill damage. Of course, even though Frostpain's defense against the cold was strong, it was enough to completely nullify Icy Burst. Zardayusu was weakened by the chill damage, and it was all he could do to stand. He was panting, and his movements were slow. His tail was even drooping into the water. Even breathing was too much work. It would be near impossible to fight anymore. He hadn't even aimed that attack. He'd just mustered the last remnants of his strength and left it up to instinct. It was only luck that he'd even hit him. Zardayusu's eyelids threatened to close, but he desperately fought to keep them open. The blow he had driven into Iguva using the last of his strength had been fatal. He watched with a faint sense of anticipation. Iguva groped and staggered. As if he could no longer maintain his body, the skin on his face peeled off and cracks appeared in the bone. Even the clothes began to disintegrate into tatters. His destruction was only a matter of time now. The moment Zardayusu confirmed his miraculous victory, a hand of skin and bones reached out and grabbed his neck.
I was created by my master as his minion. Do you really think you can destroy me so easily?
The grip seemed like it would be easy to break away from if he tried, but... A scream escaped Zardayusu's lips as intense pain shot through his entire body. Negative energy was flowing in, robbing Zardayusu of his life. Even Zardayusu, who had been trained in ways to withstand pain, had no way to manage a pain like the chill that was being directly injected into his veins.
Die, Lizardman!
Part of Iguva's face chipped off and floated up, crumbling into the sky. His life was almost at its end, but his devotion to his master made him cling to it. Zardayusu desperately resisted, but he was frightened that his body wouldn't move quite right. Zardayusu himself didn't have much life force left, and the injection of negative energy from Iguva's touch was completely sapping him. His gaze wavered, and his vision started to go dim. A white fog seemed to be covering the world. Iguva was also mobilizing all the fading consciousness he could muster, and smiled in victory at Zardayusu and his rapidly weakening resistance. He would kill this lizard man, and then he would kill the other 2 who had come at him.
These are probably top-class lizardmen.
So if he killed them, they would be fitting sacrifices to the Great One, his creator. His expression spoke louder than words, so Zardayusu could tell what he was thinking.
Die!
Zardayusu's body wouldn't move right. He could feel his temperature dropping, like poison was coursing through his body. It was even hard to breathe. Only his mental faculties were sharp in that world. He couldn't die yet. Rororo had run so hard. Zenbel had been his shield. Krush had used up all her magic. And that wasn't all. He could feel on his shoulders the weight of all the lizardmen who had fallen in this battle. Faint noises came to Zardayusu's ears as he frantically groped for a way to fight. Krush's kind voice, Zenbel's cheery voice, Rororo's cry for attention. He shouldn't have been able to hear them. Krush was unconscious and Zenbel was in a coma, and Rororo was far away. Was his brain just imagining the voices because his consciousness was muddled? Imagining words from his friends he'd met only a week ago, the cries of his family? No. No, he wasn't imagining them. They were all there with him.
Yeah! Yeah! You still have that much power?
Half-conscious, Zardayusu raised a war cry. At the same time, Iguva shouted in surprise. Zardayusu's eyes rolled to stare down Iguva. Iguva's face was twitching with rage to see the energy in Zardayusu's gaze, where before the Lizardman hadn't even been able to make eye contact.
Krush! Zenbel! Rororo! What are you planning to do? Die!
Where did that life force even come from? With every passing moment, the vast negative energy sapped and devoured it. Really, Zardayusu's limbs were heavy, and his body felt as cold as ice. Still, as he shouted each name, he felt warmth. The power welling up in him wasn't life force. Deep in his chest, it was heart. Something made a squeaking noise. It was Zardayusu's right hand. He'd balled it into a tight fist. In it, he'd gathered all his remaining energy.
Oh, the ridiculous! Why can you move? You monster!
Iguva couldn't believe his eyes that the Lizardman could still move. A creeping horror rushed through his mind, but he frantically suppressed it. He was Iguva, the one deployed from the Great Tomb of Nazarick to command the army, and most importantly, he had been created by the Great One, Ainzul Gon. He couldn't allow himself to be defeated.
"Dah! This is the end, monster!"
One moment faster. Yes, the full force punch came 1 moment before Iguva could flood him with more negative energy. Zardayusu took his tightly balled fist and slammed it into Frostpane's hilt. The blow, hard enough to draw blood from Zardayusu's hand, caused the tip of the sword in Iguva's left orbit to go completely through his head.
Ah!
Iguva wasn't dead, so he felt almost no pain, but he could comprehend that he was losing all his false life.
Ah! How stupid! Lord,
Iguva's eyes showed complete understanding that he'd been defeated. Zardayusu's body collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been cut. And as he splashed into the marsh,
forgive me.
Iguva crumpled, apologizing to his master. A silence fell over the room. Unable to believe what they'd seen in the mirror, no one spoke, besides the maid, Entama.
Master Cocytus, it appears Lord Ainz is calling you.
Understood.
With his head hanging down, Cocytus slowly turned to face Entama. Feeling the anxious gazes of his minions, he bit back the humiliation. On the other hand, however, he admired the Lizardmen. It had been a magnificent fight. Against what should have been overwhelming odds, they'd achieved victory. Certainly, the Elder Lich wasn't perfect, but he still should have been able to win.
Magnificent. Just magnificent.
The repeated word revealed Cocytus's genuine feelings. They had cleared an impossible hurdle. "It's too bad," he murmured at the scene in the mirror of the Lizardmen cheering with joy at their victory. The warriors reflected in the mirror looked so small and weak, but they'd set his heart on fire. Ah, what a waste. Cocytus wasn't sure what to do. Of his countless thoughts, he grasped one, the most horrible one. He thought hard on it, and gave his conclusion. "I guess I should go."